Hello, hello. Welcome to Survive the Jive. And today I've got a very important topic to talk about. Who is the Norse god Tyr? A lot of people think they understand who he is. Some say he's the god of battle, whereas others say he was actually originally the most important god, more important than Odin. He was a sky father. Now, there are other theories, more quite well-developed theories that have been proposed, specifically by the scholar Georges Dumézil, and I'm going to discuss that today, and also there are more conventional theories, and I'll try to give you a crash course in everything that people generally say about Tyr over the next hour. At the end of the hour, I will read out any super chats. So if you have any questions for me or my two guests, just and you want to forward them in the form of a super chat, I will read them out after we get the main discussion out the way, and then we can go into like side questions about whatever. So let me introduce my two guests. Joining me are two guys I've had before in the patron chats, so patrons will recognize them. And I've also had a chat with Dr. Boaz on his channel before. Welcome, Dr. Boaz.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here.
And can you just give a quick introduction to your area of expertise?
Sure. I'm at Columbia University at the Department of Classics. I work mainly studying comparative religion, especially how religion and modernity in the 19th century were having changes and transformations. But also I work on Latin language, especially how the prayers in Latin in the 19th century were modified according to a more classic canon opposed to a more ecclesiastic Latin from the medieval times.
Great, thank you. And your expertise will be useful later on. And also we have Angriff, who I spoke to last week as well, who you know quite a bit about Old Norse paganism, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I practice Ossetru or Germanic heathenry, whatever label you want to use. Otherwise, I also tend to study this stuff as a hobby. It's not my profession or specialty, and I didn't study it in school, but I've done a lot of reading on it, particularly Dumézil's comparative method and similar authors.
Yep, and on last week we had a really interesting chat. I was very impressed by Angriff. Had a great theory about the goddess Freya that we discussed at length. And if you become a patron on Patreon, you can see that chat and get your own opinion on it. So let me begin talking about this god. Was he a sky father? Well, his name, this comes from the idea that his name is cognate with the name for the Proto-Indo-European god, whose name literally means sky father. And that just Peter, I can't pronounce Proto-Indo-European right, but it's about that, his name became the Greek Zeus. And he also became the Roman name Jupiter, which means also in its root sky father. So, and also other gods, such as there's a god in Sanskrit, a Hindu god, who's a very minor god in the pantheon, but that name basically is Dios Peter or something like that. Dios, it means sky father. So people could start to think Tu, as he's known in Old English, or Tyr in Old Norse, he must have been a sky father too, so they believe. But there's some problems with that, mainly that there isn't actually any source that says that he's a sky father. It doesn't mention him having any paternal roles. And is the name Tyr or the Proto-Germanic Tilwas actually meaning sky? Well, Old Irish dia is cognate with Tyr, and that means God. Sanskrit deva is cognate with Tyr, and that means God. Latin de, that means God. Old Norse tivar means gods. And you can see that none of these actually mean sky. They are cognate with the Proto-Indo-European word for sky, deus, but they all come from deos, meaning God, not sky. And there's also even gods like the Baltic god of Lithuanians and such, dievas. That also comes from this root too, but we don't have to assume that therefore he is a sky father in his attributes mythologically, just because of this linguistic connection. Now, some of you may have seen Jackson Crawford recently did a video about this, and that was really interesting because we'd planned to do this video last week when I spoke to Angriff, but it was good to see Crawford addressing it, although he did seem a little bit, in my opinion, dismissive of this connection. In former video, he did say that there was a possibility that Tyr had been more significant in the Germanic pantheon than he is in the medieval Icelandic sources, which Norse philologists rely on. But in this new video, he was more dismissive, in my opinion. And he did seem to kind of discredit those who suggest a previously more important role of Tyr. Now, I'm not saying I believe that Tyr ever actually was the chief god in the Norse pantheon. I don't believe that, actually. And I know some people do think that. But I am suggesting that the sources that we have from medieval Iceland are not representative of the importance of Tyr as a god historically among Germanic people, even among Norse people, but specifically among the wider Germanic community of people. Now, before I will go into that more and talk about all the things that we can say about Tyr, but first I would like to ask Dr. Boaz a little bit about the Sky Father God that I've just talked about in Proto-Indo-European, and then we can start to seeing whether this Sky Father deity in different Indo-European religions really does resemble what we know about this god Tyr. So, Dr. Boaz, can you tell us a bit, please?
Sure. Thank you, Tom. Okay, so after going to the etymologies and the roots of the Proto-Indo-European language, and in different Indo-European language to see what is the meaning, the original meaning, and the original substance of the Sky Father. I mean, as you presented, we have the name, the reconstructed name Diaus, which of course connects very well with the Vedic Diaus, the Greek Zeus, or the less known Latin Jovis or Jovis, which is like Jupiter without the epithet of father. Here I want to present an older Latin Diovis, which is a better example of how the Sky Father Diaus in Proto-Indo-European in Old Latin really translates very well before losing this dental consonant. All these forms have an origin in a root that is built on D or day, and it can be broadly translated as give of light. So here we have a very important connection with the sky, but the sky as referred to day or daylight. It is not surprised that most of the words in the European language that are coming from this common root can have meanings like brightness, heaven, daylight, or day itself. I mean, we have here, for example, the Latin dies, or in its older accusative, diem. Then we have the Vedic, for example, an expression we have dive dive, which is day by day. An Old Greek word for midday, which is en diphios, which we have here diphios as day, that it's connected to this root. Or, for example, the modern Welsh heddiw, which is today. We have a clear connection, at least etymologically, between sky and day. If we go to the Proto-Indo-European forms with the sound, the semi-consonantic sound w, with the w, we can have dieu, or as you mentioned, the deus, which are at the origin for the Lithuanian devas or the Latvian dievs in the Baltic area. And both are definitely have the same meaning of sky, and we know through all the oral poetry and songs that were written down by ethnographers in the 19th century or even in the 18th century that this has a meaning of sky, but also is related to the heavenly divinity. Lastly, we have the father epithet. I think this is important because probably the Sky Father is known for being father, but father of what? Here first we need to go to the perfect opposite, which is going to be Mother Earth or Earth Mother, which I won't touch it because this is a full other discussion. But we shouldn't see that as being father of the gods or father of humanity. It's like this generative force of the cosmos more than the gods, because we know that different Indo-European mythologies have different origins of the gods and different fathers. Which would, for example, have the Titans in the Greek mythology with Uranos as father of the gods, but I don't want to touch these either. But it's clear that this fatherly role is knowledge from India to the Mediterranean. For example, the Vedic Dios Pitar, then we have the Greek Zeu Pater or Patros Dios, and finally we have the aggregated forms Jupiter, or the older one, Dies Peter, and finally one that was formulaic in some of the prayers that were preserved in Latin literature, like Joves Patres, even though it's not very known. All these are talking about this role as father.
Father in the sense that he's a provider of knowledge.
Well, actually, most linguists don't attribute the knowledge attribute to this fatherly epithet. It's basically like in a cosmology, the sky is father as if we can imagine like it doesn't bring life, but it brings daylight.
It fertilizes the earth.
Yeah,
what do you say?
Yeah, and in consonance with the Earth Mother, both are the setting for life and the setting for the mankind to develop and to have a living. But it also doesn't have any, let's say this way, creation perspective, because the creation in Indo-European myth is totally different. It has actually a rather different story here. But I think that we should see these generative powers as opposites in the Jungian psychology tradition, that you see, the yin yang, these polar opposites that create the whole. And here they have this role, which of course literature are going to refer a lot to the sovereign function, but the sovereign function doesn't come directly from this, but as we'll see later, it comes from a rather different concept.
Right. Yeah, we'll go into the sovereign function in a little while. Now, that was quite it was a big introduction, and as you can see, like these Sky Father deities, the ones who have the etymological relation to the Proto-Indo-European Sky Father themselves don't all, and I'm not talking about TYR here, but I just mean even the Sanskrit and the Latin ones, they don't have the same mythological roles at all, really, do they?
At all. Because, no, it's really different. I mean, in the Vedic context, Dios Peter is a rather lesser divine entity. Of the 1,000 hymns in the Rig Veda, only 6 are devoted to the Sky Father, and always with the Earth Mother. So there is no hymn to Dios Peter by himself alone. So this tells you something. This is not a divinity that it's important in the Vedic pantheon. This is rather different in the Greek-Roman tradition, because both Jupiter and Zeus have acquired a different meaning, and it's through these assumed roles from other divinities that they have become more relevant. And here we have the role of being the thunder god. They are exerting these other functions from the sky, being connected with rain. We have, for example, Homeric references to Ombros, Zeus Ombros, which is definitely the god of rain. And then we assimilate, we have all very present the mythological image of Zeus or Jupiter as being the god of the thunderbolt, which in Indo-European, Indo-European would be attributed to Perkonos in the reconstructed world. And
a secondary deity to the king Sky Father, who is allegedly the king of the gods in the original Proto-Indo-European pantheon. So we can see, quite a mega discrepancy in the theory being proposed that Tyr is a Sky Father, because not only is he, well, he's not the principal deity in this pantheon, and he doesn't have the attributes associated with mating with the earth. In fact, Odin specifically is the one who impregnates Jord, the earth giantess. So the argument is falling apart that he is the Sky Father. But I'd like to now turn back to the subject of Tyr, if I may, and just look a bit more at some of the things that we know about him, just like this plain facts. For those who aren't aware, who aren't maybe familiar with Norse mythology, let me just break down some of what we know about him, because there's not actually a great deal to go through. In the prose, the Poetic Edda, which is Icelandic, a collection of poems written down in the 13th century. There's one called Lokasenna, in which the sort of alleged trickster god, or the chaotic mischief figure of Norse mythology, Loki, reveals lots of aspects of the different deities in that pantheon through a ritual hazing, a kind of session of banter, as we say in England. And his bants are pretty harsh, and the banter that he gives to Tyr is to mock him for losing his hand in a scenario when he had to put his hand into the mouth of the wolf Fenrir when it was not fully grown. It later becomes a universe-threatening entity, but when it was not fully grown, they tried to control it. They wanted to wrap it up, and they needed to trick it, and it wouldn't allow itself to be bound. And in order to insurance policy, it said, I will only be bound if I can have one of the gods puts their hand in my mouth. And Tyr was the one who negotiated this. He was the one who used his legal knowledge to negotiate this thing, and he was the one who therefore sacrificed his hand in the process. He's also mentioned in Himmelskvida, where Tyr and Thor go to retrieve a cauldron from Jotunheim, the giant's land. Said he will die at the hands of a wolf called Garm at Ragnarok, at the end of the world. He is, that's also in Icelandic sources. We also have much earlier sources some sources rather, that are from Romans. One of the Roman sources we have is Tacitus, the Roman historian, writing sometime around the 1st century, I think. He writes about 3 principal deities of the Germans, the Germanic tribes, and these he describes as Mercury, Mars, and Hercules, I believe, or is it? Yes. Or anyway, what they're
it is Hercules. Yes.
Yes, Hercules. Thank you, Angriff. So what these have generally been understood to mean, based on the attributes, is Mercury is commonly understood to be Odin. He said, because they say it's the chief god of the Germans is Mercury, and Mercury has certain mercurial elements to do with him are associated, especially his role as with the dead, associated with Odin. Mars, a god of battle, therefore was seen to be is equated with Tyr, and that is the reason why people sometimes call Tyr a battle god. And then Hercules, wielding a club, would be associated with Thor, who may not have had the hammer attribute originally. It was some kind of bludgeoning weapon from the start, maybe an axe or a club, and becomes a hammer. Those things are quite interchangeable. This Roman association with Mars is certain. It's not just limited to Tacitus, because the days of the week, Mardi is Tuesday, right? Mars, the day of Mars, is the day that we in Germanic languages associate with Tyr. In the Old English name for Tyr is Tu, so we have Tuesday on the same day. So that was done in the Interpretatio Romana, Interpretatio Germanica, and also here in England, in Northumberland, there was an inscription. Now let me just switch now to screen share, because I think there's some cool stuff that you ought to see. Let me just excuse my boomer technology knowledge. Share. Okay, I hope you can all see this now. It says Mars Thingsus Beda and Fimelina altar as a house dead. This is just a personal altar, and it's basically this part here, Deo Marte Thinkso. Well, Dr. Boaz, your Latin's better than mine, but my understanding is that it says to Mars of the thing. And this is widely understood because it's at the time, it's before the Anglo-Saxon invasions, but it's at the time when the Romans had stationed a lot of Germanic troops in Britannia, and this has been corroborated by DNA evidence of Roman bodies found in England at that time, when they're very Nordic. They're much more Nordic than the population, the wider population. They're not like the German people in those times were more Nordic than modern Germans. So they're essentially like Scandinavians genetically. And there were Germanic gladiators in England as well, or Britannia as it was called then. So Mars of the thing is assumed based partly on Tacitus's equating of Tyr with Mars, that this means that it is actually a reference to Tyr. But the thing is the Germanic word. Well, we know this is a Germanic thing because thing is not a Latin word. Thing means, or thinksus, here's a Latinization of thing. Thing means an assembly. It's like the parliament or a meeting, and it can have religious connotations, but it can also be secular. There wasn't a clear distinction in Germanic culture anyway. So this would imply that he is a battle god in a sense. He is equated with Mars, the battle god, but he is the battle god of the assembly. So that's important for later on. We'll be talking about what exactly Tyr's role was. Now, this is one of the only time where we can really clearly recognize a god in a contemporary depiction of a god, because of the story of the wolf biting off his hand. And this is found in Trollhättan in Sweden. It's Västergötland, and this can't be anyone else. There's no other myth about a wolf biting off someone's hand. This must be Tyr. He has a peculiar headdress or hat on, I don't know, but there you have it. The Ribe rune skull, found in Jutland in Denmark. Here it says sometime between 720 and 760. It's 8th century, and it has a runic inscription which invokes a god called High Tyr, or High God. So invocation of the god Odin, a wolf, and a god in aid against magical illness. So it's a magical runic inscription on a skull. I could try and read Old Norse, but it says Ulfur auk Udin auk Hutir Glaub is Yitr Theimer Irki Yeah, Irki, Auk, Tyrkenu, Bur. Wolf and Odin and High Tyr help the pain ache, and the dwarf is defeated. Now, this is a strange inscription, and people aren't sure what it means, because Tyr is used in kennings in Old Norse to refer to any god. It can just mean a god. So Odin can be referred to in a kenning which uses the word Tyr. So obviously we know that High Tyr here does not mean Odin. It could mean Tyr. Is it an epithet they're just calling Tyr high, or does it refer to another god who is known as the high god? So here they translate it as high god rather than High Tyr. So Tyr isn't exclusively a name because it's so ubiquitous. It's so commonly seen to mean a god. And that's one of the arguments that people who argued that Tyr was formerly the principal deity of the Germanic people. They're saying that he was so important that other gods could be referred to by him. You couldn't refer to Tyr with an Odin kenning, but you can refer to Odin with a Tyr kenning. However, this argument isn't foolproof, because there's also the possibility that it just means a god, and that isn't due to the former prominence of Tyr. It's just due to the etymology of the word Tyr meaning god, as we've seen in other Indo-European languages. So yeah, it's a little bit ambiguous here, but there's another. I'll move on to some other things. What else have we got? This Rune Stone. This is really cool, I think, because it's got not only an invocation of Tyr, but it's got a little picture. And I think I've drawn it out that way. I think this might be a depiction of Tyr, because it doesn't say who it is, and it invokes our man Tyr, our god. So this could be a depiction of him. The actual runic inscription says, "Who's in a tub that sparkles? Vifrod, for his great-grandfather, painted it. The bat is hidden in this rush of joy and eternity. The sun in the fire. Tyr, Tyr, Tyr. Out, 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 Billinger. Tyr drives out fatigue from here." Now, Billinger is a giant, I think, whose daughter, according to Havenmal, Odin wishes to have sex with. But what's the relevance of driving out Billinger here, and why is Tyr the solution for driving him out? I don't know. Billing is the problem of the incantation, and this spell gets rid of him. And why does Odin want to have sex with his daughter? I don't know. So this is interesting. These things together, this very curious. We don't really understand it. But the triple invocation of Tyr, 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 is something that we see in other cases as well. So in Sigdrifamal, it says, "Winning runes learn if thou longest to win, and the runes on the sword hilt write." So victory, you must learn victory runes if you want to win, and you've got to write those victory runes on the hilt of your sword. Some on the furrow and some on the flat, and twice shalt thou call on Tyr. And now we find lots of swords that do have the Tyr rune. The one that looks like a T, it's in my Survive the Jive logo, and it's in this Rune Stone. And also it's in other things as well, not just on swords, where it would be, if Sigdrifamal is correct, it would be like a way of making sure you're victorious in battle. But much older, we can go way back before the Viking Age, and we see the Lindholm amulet. The Lindholm amulet is also from Sweden, but it's from the migration era. So long before the Vendel era, before the Viking Age. This is really old. And yeah, it's from 500-talet, meaning about 500 AD maybe. That's bloody old. And here we have the actual runic inscription doesn't say anything here. It's a magical inscription. You can tell magical inscriptions because it's just repeating runes. So you've got the ash rune repeated, and then you have 3 Tyr runes, 3 in a row. Like we've said, that is probably an invocation of Tyr, Tyr, Tyr. So what do we have here? The pyre. This is a friend who is not with us tonight, Redbeard, has made this little drawing for us to show that the Proto-Indo-European root dew goes separately to sky, from which we get Deus and Zeus and Jupiter, to Deos, meaning God. So although these words are all related, you don't always have to assume that all these people, like the word was always associated with sky, or maybe it is. Don't know, but they could have made that association. So basically, and oh, by the way, the fact that the Lindholm amulet is so old, and also the fact that Anglo-Saxon swords also had tiered runes back before the Anglo-Saxons converted, and the Anglo-Saxon converted a few hundred years before the Norse did. So Anglo-Saxon paganism is much older, and the separation, or it's not older because the Norse were pagan at the same time too, but I mean, the sources that we have, it means it's long before the Norse sources were written down, like Snorri Sturluson. So together, the Anglo-Saxon and this migration near Sweden artifact show that the Tyr cult was big before the Viking Age. And that's important because that reinforces this argument that some people have that Tyr was originally much more important than the later Icelandic sources indicate. Now, let's move on to Dumézil. Georges Dumézil, professor of an expert on comparative religion, specifically Indo-European religion. You should really read his book. We'll be mainly referring to his books. We will mainly be referring to one called Mitra Varuna this evening. And I think to introduce his theory, specifically as it relates to Tyr, it's time to get Angriff on. And perhaps you can introduce us to this, Angriff.
Yeah, I mean, I think most people are probably familiar with the basic comparative tripartite philosophy of interpreting the Indo-European religions ideas that Dumézil's, basically all of his work flows from that in some aspect, and it's influenced a lot of thinkers onward. And you have, it's the basic breakdown is you have the first tier or caste, which are tied to sovereignty mainly. The second tier is tied to the warrior caste, and the third tier are economic producers and commercial and farmers and everyone with that. And then he ties that there are deities that go along with each tier. Specifically, what we're discussing today about Tyr and Mitra Varuna, the theory that Dumézil presents within this work is sort of a dialectical relationship between two different deities in different i.e. pantheons that have different required elements of sovereignty that work together in their own roles and their own areas and functions, as I said, in a dialectical fashion to really complete the first tripartite role of sovereignty. And obviously from the title, one of the primary examples he uses to develop this is the Vedic pair of deities, Mitra and Varuna. He ties Mitra into dealing with sort of contracts, negotiating peace, and sort of an element of maintaining day-to-day typical laws and religious customs. Whereas Varuna he calls them sort of the binder in one aspect, that he sort of enforces people that break the law. He's also tied with being the terrible magician, which also ties him to warrior cults, which is the Gandharvas, specifically in India. And sort of but the main aspect is this sort of terrible sorcerer sovereign figure. And after he develops the Vedic example, he further ties into the Roman example, which is it's a much more complicated argument to develop because of the way that we have, basically the form of Roman mythology we have tends to be this late form where they've sort of desacralized a lot of it and turned it into a historical narrative rather than a supernatural narrative in a lot of ways. So within that one, he sort of has to break it down to three different routes of showing the same origin in this dual sovereignty of gods. The first one is with the specific gods, which is Jupiter and Deus Phidias, with Jupiter being basically having become the terrible sovereign, and Deus Phidias being regarded as the enforcer of contracts, the enforcer of day-to-day laws, and thus he ties them to the cult of the Flamens, who basically negotiate and run the day-to-day religious laws that regulate normal day-to-day Roman civic society, while he goes on to tie Jupiter to the Luperci, who celebrate an annual festival called Lupercalia, which, you know, we have some silly views of due to post-Christian takes, but basically in the original form seems to have been a celebration both of Romulus founding Rome and stealing the Sabian women, but it also has to do with, you know, there's the whipping the women for increasing fertility for the year and several other aspects. So within Dumézil's,
right?
Sorry?
They had that in Lithuania too for exactly the same thing, right? Well, and Latvia, sorry, Latvia. They have that in folk custom now.
Oh, yeah. Right. And the third aspect that he ties into the same dual sovereignty in the Roman historicized mythology is well, first there's, you know, the first two kings of Rome being Romulus and Numa. So he establishes that Romulus is tied to this terrible sovereign figure, and he established things like the Lupercalia. He did things like guide stealing the Sabian women and founding the actual city of Rome, while Numa is tied to as the second sovereign, establishing the day-to-day cult of the Flamens and sort of these civic laws and peaceful relationships and contract laws that negotiated civic life in Rome. And to tie it into the topic that we're really trying to hit on today's discussion, he obviously makes the same comparison between Tyr and Odin. Again, he really operates highly from this perspective of the terrible sovereign, which is obviously Odin, versus the sovereign who's tied to peace, law, contract, which goes along with, you know, with Tyr being the god of the thing and being Mars Thingsus in the Interpretatio Romanum, whatever.
And on that note, I've been told in the chat that I actually wasn't screen sharing when I did that screen share bit before you started. So I'm just quickly going to show the things that people didn't see, including right now you'll see on screen the Mars of the Thing inscription from Northumberland that I mentioned. And this is the depiction from a bracket from Trollhättan of Tyr and the wolf biting him that I mentioned. And this is the runic inscription on the Reba rune skull from Jutland that I mentioned. And this is that rune stone with the picture of with the triple invocation to Tyr in the spell, and the Tyr's head is here, and here's the enlarged version of the head that I've drawn around. And this is the Lindholm amulet. And that's sorry to have kept you, to have messed it up. But as I said, Boomer Tech, you've got to forgive me for that. So now we have an introduction to the ideas of Dumézil. We should explore a little bit more about what he's saying. So basically, in Dumézil's argument, is Tyr actually a sky father? He's primarily talking about Tyr as the sovereign function of order and justice, as opposed to Odin, who has a sovereign function also, but in a dark shadow of that. But they multiple. Well, I think I can read some quotes from the book as well. I have here. This is the book that we're talking about today, Mitra Varana, and I've got some bookmarks with the relevant bits. He says the Scandinavian Triad is defined precisely this way: Odin, the sovereign magician; Thor, the champion thunderer; Freyr or Njord, lubricious and peaceful producer. However, he sees Odin or Rodnaz and Tiras or Tyr as a dual gods sharing that sovereign function. see, the first function of sovereignty is not presided over by a single god. On the Wodenas, there is TYRs or two. When Tacitus names the three great gods of the German tribes as Mercurius, Mars, and Hercules, we should recognize them as the dual couple Wodenas TYRs, the two gods of sovereignty, plus the champion Thunras. And he's referencing Jan de Vries, another scholar on this subject. What else do we have from him to get the gist of this theory? Tiras was both a protector in battle and a protector of the assembly. So his function of a battle god is specifically different to what we think of as a war god. He says war is not in fact the bloody hand-to-hand combat of battle. It is a decision arrived at by combat between two parties and governed by precise rules in law. And
the other point in that specific angle that makes a lot of sense is why the Romans would have seen Tyr as the war god of the Germans, because if they were having any arrangements of where and when to have a battle, or negotiating a peace, or negotiating an alliance, it would have probably been a ceremony and a contract dedicated to Tyr on behalf of the Germanic tribe.
Exactly right, because they were only really mixing with the Germans to fight them. So yeah, he continues. The legitimate patron of battle, defined as an exchange of blows, is Thunras, Thor. So obviously Thor, Odin, you can call them all like battle gods if you want to be, pedantic, but there's specifically different ways. Like Thor is the one who's the god of strength. He embodies masculine combat, and he's the one who uses his physical power to overcome his enemies in every scenario in the mythology that's presented to us in the Icelandic sources. Odin is the god of war, but in a magical sense. He's the one who inspires battle frenzy. He's the one who uses magic to get his way, uses wisdom. But Tyr is one who has a judicial function, and that's crucial to the argument that Dumézil is presenting.
I wanted to add something about this judicial aspect. Not dealing with the etymology of Tyr, but the Jupiter, Zeus are all gods of oaths, and we can see that in fossilized in expressions like, for example, the Latin supioe under Jovis, which is when an oath needs to be witnessed by the god. We do it under the sky. Actually, the old temple of Jupiter in Rome had like the Pantheon, an opening, an oculus, to do the oaths under the sky, under the god. And this extends very well as the judicial aspect of the Sky Father. I wanted to add this because I think it's a very important role in one of the sovereign functions that Dumézil is going to be exposing in the Mitra Varuna book.
Yeah, that's important to say, but also I should say we should specify that this sovereign function is not necessarily connected to the Sky Father. For example, like we've already established that, Thunras is like Perquanos, the thunder god, and Jupiter is also he's the sovereign god he has the sovereign function in Roman religion, but he also has aspects of the storm god, but he also has aspects of the Sky Father. So you can see how the different pantheons often have mingled and intermixed different parts. So if we can establish perhaps Tyr does have elements of a Sky Father, or perhaps he doesn't, or is he, the connection to the day, it would make that argument that he had an element related to the Sky Father more plausible. So we should explore that. But there's lots of things that seems that he doesn't have that. But certainly the jurist, if as you say, the jurist, the connection of sovereign and judicial function is connected to the daylight sky, or whether that's just something that happened in Rome or not. Do you have anything to add on that, Angriff?
The thing that just came to mind that was a specific example from Mitra Varuna was that Dumézil made a specific comparison between Tyr losing the hand to make the guarantee to the Fenrir wolf with
Yes.
the historical heroic figure in the Roman history. His name is what, Scaevola or something? It's something like that. I'm sorry, my language is terrible.
I don't know how to pronounce it.
But it means something like the left-handed, right?
Ask Dr. Boaz.
Yes, yes. It's a. I mean, it's still today we have the right path or the left path. This basically connected to the right path, which is the judiciary path. The connected to Deus Fideus, to Fides, which is more of the Numa Pompilius side, which you mentioned, the order, the establishment, the safety of the magistrate in the Roman monarchy at that time, opposed to the Febra, the Luperca, the Lupercalia, the Remulus. That's going to be, the spontaneous violence, the foundational violence. I think this plays very well in this duality that both divinities or group of divinities are going to be practicing, and Jupiter at some point being the mediator, at least in a figure type. I mean, he's a type that can be connected to both. It depends on the discourse and who is using Jupiter and in what context he is being used.
Right, and to tie up the example I brought up, as I said, Dumézil compares it between Tyr cutting his hand or losing his hand to the Fenrir wolf is the example of Scaevola burning his hand in front of an invading force and basically using that to negotiate a peace and save the city of Rome in the epic history. So again, we have a figure who is tied to establishing contract and order and saving from a vital disaster. It's a metaphysical one in the Norse source of the Fenrir wolf, but it's a physical army that would have destroyed Rome in the Roman source. But the sacrifice that the guarantor does is he loses his right hand in the deal in both cases.
Yeah.
So this is clearly a very old Indo-European theme that has come to us in divergent forms.
Clearly, and he also gives the example in the Hindu example of Savitr, which is from the root of the Vedic Suvati, to excite, to set in motion, to vivify, and Savitr is the god who has lost his hands. So there we have a clear evidence that there's this theme of not necessarily losing one hand, but a god who has something altering both hands or one hand, and that this is somehow linked to his or function as a judge or an arbiter, mediator, and
we have the other side of this reflected in both sources as well, where we have obviously Odin has sacrificed his eye for wisdom in Mimir's Well, and in the Roman historical epic that we take as being sort of a historicized mythology, we have the hero Cocles, who is basically weirdly alluded to being one-eyed and sort of staring people down and freezing them and helping to win another epic battle that saved Rome in its early history. Which, if we look at that and realize that it's it's something that was originally a supernatural mythological thing that's been sort of transposed in a historical narrative. And again, it shows a hero in the type of this terrible sovereign, who's tied to sorcery.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a really clear. I mean, there's no doubt to my mind that this is a correct identification by Dumézil of this enduring motif of a god who loses an eye or sacrifices an eye, and the one who loses the hand, and that these two gods are connected to mythological and social functions of sovereignty and judicial function. We can. Do you have something you were looking up there, Dr. Boaz, that you wanted to say?
No, I would just checking the Cocles. I think it's again the historical use of myth, or how the Romans express myth in historical narrative. I think checking the Titus Livius account of Cocles, we have this duality again, that we have I'm having these words fagor, clamor, pavore subito impetum sustinuit. This violence, this spontaneous violence that can be terrifying. But then how from all these comes this kind of a legal peace that, of course, saves Rome in front of an enemy, but both narratives are going to be interconnected all across the historical narrative of Rome. And this goes to the foundational event. I'm not knowledgeable enough in the Nordic Germanic mythology to see this figure, but definitely in Rome is very powerful. And this is my question for you: how we see, besides the Wotan with the eye and Tyr with the hand, how we see this from this violence, this primal violence coming, established state judiciary system of imparting right justice.
Well, the argument that Dumézil makes is that the Germanics had a uniquely, I think he used the term classless, because of their tendency to move away from the hierarchies of other Indo-European societies. The functions have been altered duly as a result. So, but there is still this dichotomy with Odin and Tyr, or Wodenaz.
I would say, at least to my mind, the closest thing you're going to find to that in the Germanic corpus is basically that you get these warrior types, these berserker type warriors. Starkadr is the one that first primarily comes to mind.
He's associated
and that he is a warrior that's specifically associated with kings and helping them win battles and establish laws. And he is clearly this transgressive figure who's basically other people see as a weirdo. He doesn't fit in. He's even born in a monstrous form. I think it's like he has, 6 arms, and that 4 of them are removed by Thor after he's born.
Yeah, indicating a troll.
So he's very much in the same vein, but he doesn't exactly have the same aspect of laying down, the foundational things that later lead to a more ordered society of a city.
I see. It's very interesting, though, how the myth is presenting as well this dichotomy, this dual system.
Yeah, it's the same thing as well. It's the berserker and the berserkers and the chaotic, the kind of, if we talk about another book, not go too much into it, but Kershaw's The One-Eyed God and the Indo-European Men, and it talks about this chaotic element of the wolf tribe, the wolfish tribe of young men, Odin devotees, berserkers, Ulfhedner, and they're kind of outside society. They're not the normal part of, they're certainly not normal people. They're not the average pagans of the time. Whereas in that case, you could see this sort of similarity to the Lupercalia and things like that on the outside.
Absolutely.
And the establishment of order comes from another source and another kind of, another deity, another function in the mythology. So some points to consider for the finishing and to discuss, I wanted to bring up. So we can say that the names can be misleading, and that the linguistic affiliation doesn't always equate to a shared role. Just because they have that name doesn't mean they're the same. That just because their names are related in the mythologies. Skyfather is not always the chief deity, like Jupiter is, but in the deus, however you say the name of the Sanskrit one, deus pater, is not. And so we can't infer that even if Tyr's name did have a etymological relationship to the daylight sky, I mean, obviously it's cognate with the word for daylight sky, but even if it is actually descended from a Germanic word for daylight sky, which it might not be, it might just mean God, that still wouldn't actually prove that he was ever the chief deity of the Germanic pantheon. Yeah, and the Proto-Indo-European word for God and for sky are linguistically related, but they can be different. They can separate. So do you have anything to say on that, gentlemen?
Just one other thing that I know was an interesting note that was used when people were originally trying to tie Varuna to Odin before they realized that there was no etymological link in the names, despite the superficial similarity, is that both also are known for being a god of many names.
Which god? Sorry, can you repeat that, please?
Varuna
Odin.
and Odin.
Okay. Would you say what? Do you say Other? What? Which god in Odin? I didn't hear
I think he said Wotan, Odin.
Varuna.
Varuna. Sorry, Varuna. All right. Okay.
Yeah.
Oh yeah. The Vedic god. We hadn't discussed Varuna very much, so I'd forgotten.
And
yeah.
Another interesting detail that he mentioned, re the relative importance of Odin and Tyr, is that in the Rig Veda, they're frequently mentioned in this couplet form of Mitra Varuna. But when it comes to individual, I believe he said that there was only one Rig Veda hymn that specifically invokes Mitra alone, and it's compared to several with Varuna.
Yeah, as a dual function, it reinforces that idea that they were connected. I'd like to also bring up the fact that although I accept the theory of Mitra Varuna and the connection of the idea that Varuna would be, a mythic cognate in that sense to Odin, and Mitra in that sense to Tyr, because as we said, there's not always direct mythic cognates. I think that the Vedic god Brihaspati, which is the Vedic priest god who shows he's in myth just a priest who is very, very pious, but is worshipped as a god, even though he himself is one who performs sacrifices for the gods. And this, to me, seems so similar to the mythic function of Odin, who is the one who demonstrates the first sacrifice. He shows the man how to sacrifice. He brings knowledge of esoteric knowledge. That's what runes means. Esoteric knowledge brings that to mankind, and he demonstrates sacrifice. And he also sacrifices himself to learn knowledge. So he's like a divine priest. You could say magician, but I think that it's possible for him simultaneously, Odin, to have aspects of the sky father that he mates with the earth, Jord, aspects of Varuna, which is a sovereign function, but the chaotic shadow of the sovereign function, and also aspects of the divine priest. So comparative mythology is actually quite complicated. It's not cut and dry. You say this one is this one and that one's that one. It gets a bit complex, but that makes it more interesting, I'd say. Right then. Well, I guess we're coming to the end. We're actually reached an hour now. We're nearly 5 minutes off an hour, and it seems like we've covered most of the ground we intended to. I don't have much else to say. I'll go through some.
There was one other detail that occurred to me that was interesting that Dumézil developed in this book regarding the sacrifice and everything, is that he specifically ties Odin coming back after he's deposed by the Bad King, whether by Olorus or his two brothers, depending on which source you use, to reestablishing the proper form of sacrifice, which in the Germanic corpus is interestingly the sacrifice to all of the gods at once, rather than propitiations to a particular god, which is, as far as I'm aware, basically the opposite of the narrative you get with that in the Indic sources or Vedic sources. It was an interesting argument that he developed, he even sort of claimed that it included as well the way that Tacitus described the Germans as never permanently assigning land and stuff, and being sort of ties into their less hierarchical society, at least at that time.
Yeah, which may relate to the fact that it was a much larger land area with fewer people in it, so that different forms of human cooperation required for a successful society. Same as they have now, actually. It's very sparsely populated, quite large areas in Scandinavia. But yeah, which source were you talking about that says that they sacrificed to all the gods rather than one specific one?
I mean, it was specifically Dumézil's interpretation of it, but I honestly can't recall which work in the Edda that narrative came from.
I do remember there's a Vedic poem where it says, "May we have all the gods." I mean, there's an Edic thing where it says, "May all the gods" as well. But I know there's Vedic things where it says, "May." They list this god, then that god, then that god, and they say, and then all the gods. So they list three by name and then say afterwards all the gods. So that does occasionally happen in Vedic religion as well, where they just say to everyone. And I know the Romans, didn't they have Boaz? Did they not have like a temple to all gods, like the pantheon? Does that not mean all gods?
And it was critical for the well-being and the harmony of the state to sacrifice to all gods and to have this dimension of the all gods, besides the Capitoline Triad, which was central and what triggered Dumézil to conceive the three-functional.
Definitely, the three gods thing is a big thing in Germanic as well. We can see from Adam Bremen when he goes to Uppsala and he says there are three deities there as well when he uses. But in that case, it's different from the three principal deities that our Roman friend Tacitus identifies a few hundred years before. So in Uppsala, he identifies one of them as Fricko, which is widely accepted to mean Frey or Yngvi Freyr. So that makes things a bit more complicated. But once again, comparative mythology is complicated. But we can't go too much into Yngvi Frey tonight. But maybe I should go into super chats. I haven't had many.
It was from Saxo Grammaticus. I'm looking at the page in Mitra Veruna now.
Oh, can you read? What did Saxo say? Do you remember?
He asserted that the anger and resentment of the gods could not be appeased by conjoined and mingled sacrifices. He forbade them to offer up their prayers collectively, establishing separate libations for each of the gods. And this is the god that was present when Odin was deposed, which is referred to as Myth-Odin in this particular.
Very interesting.
And then when Odin reappears, he obligating all those who had borne titles of celestial honors in his absence to lay them down is not rightfully theirs, and reestablishes the collective sacrifice.
We should just say quickly for the people who don't know who Saxo Grammaticus is. He is a 12th century 12th century Danish chronicler. So he's writing about 100 years before all the Icelandic stuff we have. So even though Saxo, people don't like him as much because he's very, very anti-pagan, and his description of the pagans, gods, and their religion is all very disapproving and probably loaded with Christian propaganda. But it does also provide some insights that we don't get from Snorri. So it's a really useful source. That thing is about all gods, for example. I don't think we heard that from Snorri. So that's really cool. The Gesta Danorum is his book, by the way. That is of interest to us. So I have one question from Altorin, and thank you for your donation. They ask, would the Mesopotamians be considered a branch of Proto-Indo-European peoples? Absolutely not, in no regard whatsoever. They had no relation to them. There's no connection, and there's no reason whatsoever to think that they were. Their languages are Semitic or Proto-Semitic or something like that, but certainly not Indo-European. That's very easy to answer. No other questions. And I'll just say thank you to the other super chat, which was from Amor Fati before the actual stream began. Well, gents, I guess we can wrap this up for the evening. Would any of you like to add any closing comments before we finish?
No. Thank you so much for having us here. I'm very happy to be sharing all these etymological and linguistic remarks, and look forward to the next one.
Yeah. Also, thank you for having me. I don't really have anything else to add, but it was good and hopefully informative discussion.
Yeah, I think this went really well. You guys were brilliant, and I'm glad I got you both on this evening because it wouldn't have been good without you. So thank you both very much. Dr. Boaz has a channel, so you can check out more of his stuff if you go and have a look, Google it. He's got some stuff on the Indo-European horse twins. Angriff doesn't have a channel to my knowledge, so I guess you just have to wait and see if he comes on here again if you want to see more of him. And of course, I will be back in 2 weeks with my next Jive stream, and I'll be uploading very soon a video about Slavic paganism, which I filmed in May, and it's just taken me a while to get it ready. But don't worry, it's coming. I know the Slavic people are angry with me for never talking about Slavs. I'm so sorry, but I'm going to make up for it very soon. Okay, good night, everyone, and thanks for watching.